Welcome. This is a series of talks on autism and the law, sponsored by the College of Education and the Autism Center of Excellence at Southern Connecticut State University. I'm Fred Volkmar. I'm a professor of special education, as well as at the Yale University Child Studies Center, a professor of child psychiatry. And this series of talks is meant to give an introduction to autism and the law for legal professionals. We hope you're going to find this of great interest. We're going to start with a very short introduction to what makes autism autism and how you understand the implications of autism for interacting with a client with autism spectrum disorders. So what is autism? Autism is an early onset disorder, probably from before birth. It was initially described by Lee O'Connor back in 1943 as a disturbance of what he called affective contact or autism, lacking the connection to other people. In contrast to typically developing infants, there was not the same interest and engagement with people as there was in normal development. If anyone has had a typically developing child and very early in life, you realize how socially engaged they are with parents. And Connor really said this is from very early in life, and now we think probably even before birth, a problem of making that social connection. The other thing he mentioned was that these were kids who had problems with change and they had trouble with the environment. And these two things are probably intimately connected, because if you're not connected to the world of people, you are more connected to the world of things. So you're trying to make sense out of the world through things rather than people. And I mention this because sometimes in talking to a lay audience, and you can see on the right here, I had the experience a few years ago of talking to the Boy Scout troop in Wallingford, Connecticut, about a boy who had joined the troop and had dropped out. He had Asperger's. He had a strong interest in toasters. He would come up to the other kids and start talking about, oh, you see the Proctor Silex 6386B just came out, and they would look at him like he was from outer space. And so he thought they couldn't be his friends. And the scoutmaster came and talked to me about this and asked me if I would talk to the troop about autism. And I said I would be happy to. And I realized using all the A words like autism and Asperger's, their eyes were kind of glazing over. And I said, okay, let's reframe this. How many of you know somebody with a disability? They wear glasses, they have a hearing aid, they have a cane, or, oh, yeah, they all do that. And we support people with disabilities. And, oh, yeah, we always make accommodations. How many of you know somebody with a hidden disability? Oh, what's that? They have problems with reading or spelling or math. Oh, yeah, we know. So I explained autism is a kind of a learning disability that's a social learning disability that starts very early in life. And sometimes that's an easier way for a lay audience to understand how important autism is in terms of coloring the whole aspect of learning and development. The current DSM-5 system, which came into effect in 2013, recognizes autism spectrum disorder. This system is a somewhat more stringent system than in the past, although cases with Asperger's disorder and some other conditions that were previously recognized have been grandfathered in, and we'll talk at least a little bit about that. So these cases continue to have their label, they continue to have eligibility for services, which in the US is a very important thing in and of itself. So terms, interchangeable terms: autism spectrum disorder, autism, autistic disorder, childhood autism, infantile autism, essentially mean more or less the same thing. These are things that are associated with communication delays, as well as problems in the past, especially with intellectual disability, or what we used to call mental retardation. This has changed markedly in the last 20 to 30 years with the provision of more effective treatments. When I first got into the field back in 1980, the vast majority of people with autism had intellectual deficiency. Many, probably 70, 75%, didn't ever talk. Those numbers have really dramatically shifted now with the provision of effective services, so that most talk, only a small number never talk, and increasingly people are not functioning in the range of mental retardations. It's now a much smaller minority. Asperger's disorder is slightly different, and that the early development seems fine, but as the children start to interact with their peers, typically in 3 or 4 or 5 as they enter preschool, they have real trouble. They seem to be hyper-focused on a topic of interest to them. They still have major problems in social interaction, but they're pretty verbal. And these two conditions, Asperger's on the one end and autism on the other, sort of set the tension between a broad versus a narrow view of autism and autism spectrum. Other terms that you may hear: pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, or PDD-NOS, was a term used before DSM-5 to talk about individuals with some features of autism, but not all features of autism. This term probably and inadvertently overlaps to a great extent with a different term, something called the broader autism phenotype. We've become aware, both in terms of genetics, but also in terms of the psychology, that there are many people who have some features of autism, but not the whole condition. And if you have great attention to detail, you can be a good accountant or a cartographer or any number of things. And we think that these things may ultimately turn out to be related. That may be one of the reasons why some of the genes involved in autism, which is a very strong genetic condition, have persisted. The broader autism phenotype, or BATP, you'll sometimes hear, is related to and has some overlap with the older term. So a short history of autism. It was first explicitly recognized by Leo Kanner back in 1943. He was the first child psychiatrist in the country, and he wrote his paper, his classic paper, on disturbances of affective contact or early infantile autism. A year later, a medical student in Germany, a man named Hans Asperger, wrote a paper about a group of boys who had trouble forming social groups. He used the same word, autism. He talked about autistic personality disorder. So he emphasized that social connection, but these were kids who were hyperverbal and had these unusual interests. And again, that sort of sets the tension of the two way back to the 1940s. There was early confusion about autism related to some aspects, especially of Leo Kanner's definition. For example, was it an early form of schizophrenia? The answer is no, it's quite different. Do parents cause autism? No, it's a neurobiological condition that's also very strongly genetic, and one that responds much better to structured treatment and to unstructured psychotherapy. So again, research starting in the 1970s really emphasized that autism was brain-based. About 15 to 20% of children with classical Kanner's autism develop seizures, sometimes very early in life, sometimes in adolescence, which for other kids is a very unusual time to develop seizures. This evidence was very strong that autism was a brain-based condition. The first twin studies were also done in the late 70s in the United Kingdom. They looked at monozygotic, meaning identical twins, same genetic background, and fraternal twins of the same sex, because there's potentially a gender difference in autism. And they discovered that identical twins, the rate of concordance, one twin has autism, the other one is very likely, 90% plus, to have autism. Fraternal twins, maybe 10 to 20% higher than the general population, but much less than the identical twins. This was very strong evidence for the genetics of autism. Also around this time, the first studies were done showing that structured treatment, things like behavior modification, special education, really led to improved functioning rather than unstructured psychotherapy. And there were also in the 70s where there were first attempts to really try to define autism. These were relied on in the early DSM-3 definition and the first recognition of autism that was done in 1980. So we're going to have other discussions in this series of talks about some of the problems people with autism have. Let me say a word about some of the fundamental aspects of autism. First and foremost, autism is a disorder of the social brain. We know there are different ways that, for example, people with ASD process things like the human face and social interaction. This has been shown both on EEG, but also functional neuroimaging. And these findings have been well repeated across the world. So we know they're very significant, and we know what parts of the brain seem to be involved. It seems to be, and this has been shown from eye tracking, which is some work that actually started with some of my colleagues and myself at Yale some years ago now, that if you use methods to actually look at where people with autism look when they look at social scenes, they have real problems sorting out social interaction. They miss about 90% of the social affective information They tend to focus on the mouth as opposed to the upper part of the face. As a result, they miss a lot of what is going on. And one of the things we've come to appreciate is how the social brain, the problems in the social brain functioning have really a profound impact on development, especially if you don't do interventions. So just to give you an example, this is one of the first studies. This is the first study, Bob Schultz and colleagues, including myself, some years ago now, and the reference is at the bottom. We did functional neuroimaging, having people with autism and a matched control group. These were pretty high functioning people with autism and people who were typically developing, and they had to lie in the magnet, perfectly safe, magnetic, not X-ray, and they had a button in each hand. And they had to say, same or different, same or different, same or different. These long sequences of faces versus objects. We also looked at patterns, but I'm not going to talk about that. And what we were interested in was, how does the brain process faces versus objects in these fMRI studies? fMRI looks at brain function. It looks at where is the blood going when people do this particular activity. This finding has now been very well replicated with, I think, over 30 papers showing that it works. It's a very clear finding in the field, and it's one that's important in terms of understanding autism. And here I wanted to show you very briefly, and I apologize for the neuropathology slides. This is a slice through the brain, right about here, behind my ear. It would be like I'm having a plane go through there. And on each side, you see something called the fusiform gyrus. Here is the thing on a real brain from the bottom. Actually, it exists on both sides. It's on the underneath side of the brain. It seems to be very much involved for most of us in face recognition. So this fusiform gyrus is the area that typically developing folks use in looking at faces. And there's a whole body of work on this. But this was the first study in autism, and it showed this very interesting difference. Typical folks looking at faces over objects, the blood came to this fusiform face area. But look at the people with autism and Asperger's. Not so at all. It speaks to the fact that they're looking at faces in a very different way. They're not seeing faces in that special part of the brain that the rest of us use. So faces have no special relevance to them other than just things in the environment. Most of us seeing a face, that's something we immediately connect with. So what's the trouble with this? If you come into the world, like most of us, with a social frame, a lot of things happen. People are the center of your world. I remember meeting my newborn child who's now in her 30s. And the first time after a long labor and delivery and a C-section and a whole package of stuff, I hold the child in my arms. She's looking at me, I'm looking at her, and we are in business and still are 30 plus years later. This kicks in very quickly. Babies are focused on faces and have a tendency to look at things that look like faces. We have things that develop very quickly: joint attention, imitation, affective reciprocity. I'm sad, she's sad. I'm happy, she's happy. The desire to communicate kicks in very strongly, and babies learn on their own to communicate very effectively in the vast majority of cases without formal intervention. We don't send infants to language school. It just happens because they're so engaged socially. Other things happen as well. Incidental learning, just watching how mom and dad and siblings, for that matter, cope with things in the world. The baby takes this all in. If you don't have that social frame, this is lost to you. And the other thing I should mention is multitasking. Multitasking is what psychologists call executive functions. It's being able to kind of organize and forward plan to achieve a goal. You realize things have multiple steps, you don't get stuck. People with ASD have real problems with forward planning. Part of that, I think, reflects their difficulties with this lack of social frame. If you're a good social player, you get very good at shifting back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between all the aspects of social interaction. You have autism, you tend to get stuck much more readily. So the bottom line is, you come into the world typically developing. People are the center of your world, and that colors it. That is not true if you have ASD. So if you don't have that social frame, what happens? You have an interest in the non-social world, things where you're trying to make connections. You know, you're following the dots, quite literally. things become much more relevant. You're not interested in me, you're looking at the background, or you're looking at the slide and the little dots moving. You're trying to make sense of the world, but in a different way. So that failure of social orientation means you're looking at the environment, you're looking for consistency and stability. You would like contingency because that's what makes good sense to you. Sensory responsiveness increases dramatically because you're not so focused on people, you're focused on other things. You also have a tendency to learn things in chunks. This is what's called Gestalt learning. It's one of the things that accounts in autism, for example, for something called echolalia, where you hear the child with autism say something like, I want a cookie, want a cookie, want a cookie, want a cookie, and they just repeat it over and over. They don't hear the individual words. They've learned that phrase as the request. Typical babies, by the time they start to talk, segment language. They don't typically echo except in certain very specific situations where they're learning new words, or they're trying to keep something in memory, or they're learning a foreign language. But it's a reflection in autism of this tendency to learn things in chunks as opposed to break them apart. They also have difficulties in this multitasking and organization, and they lack the social attention that's necessary. For example, by the time you get to first grade, we expect kids to sit in their little chair, pay attention to the teacher and the blackboard for relatively long periods of time. You can imagine what it's like if you have no interest in social interaction, how that's not going to go so well because the teacher is no more relevant to you than anything else in the environment. In fact, she may be even less relevant. So what are some of the specific processes? So let me show you some of the earliest work actually that came out of Yale. This was an undergraduate students research project. You're about to see him and the lovely Emily Volkmar, who was in the 5th grade at the time and negotiated with her father for $10 to be the guinea pig for this. She is wearing a baseball cap that cost about $20,000 that we developed, and it uses infrared technology. Infrared means it's safe, but you can't see it, it's invisible. It looks exactly where she is looking on the screen and exactly the most sensitive part of her eye. So we want to know what people are focusing on. So look at this short video. Warren Jones, I want to credit, who's one of the authors of the study, was the Yale undergraduate, as well as to thank Emily, who negotiated her fee up from the original offer of $5 to $10.
Our research in autism uses the latest advances in eye tracking technology. Mounted on the bill of a baseball cap is an infrared video oculography system. 2 miniaturized cameras and an inline dichroic mirror non-invasively track the movements of a participant's eye. The image processing is done in real time with specialized hardware. The participant sits, watching videos, while coordinate data marking the exact spot he or she is focusing on are superimposed in real time onto a duplicate image of the participant's field of view. In our recent work, individuals watched clips from the film version of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. The movie was chosen for its demanding social complexity, intended to mirror the situations in everyday life that are most difficult for individuals with autism. Each frame of the video is overlaid with a cross marking the spot on which a viewer is focusing. The resultant video sequence can be analyzed and coded for a detailed characterization of viewing patterns. The present clip shows, in slow motion, where a cognitively able individual with autism is focusing as the social scene unfolds. As can be seen, he focuses primarily on the mouths of the people he watches. In contrast, a typically developing viewer, matched for age, sex, and verbal IQ, monitors the conversation by focusing on people's eyes. By coupling the eye tracking technology with scenes of intense social interaction, at times unexpected and explosive, we were able to observe a viewer's first reaction when visually scanning for information.
So we chose little clips from a very intensely social movie with minimal distractions. We didn't want the Terminator movies where Governor Schwarzenegger was tearing up the great state of California. We wanted something that was very intimate and social. So we took a few clips, very short clips, 5-second clips from the classic movie, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and showed them to people with ASD and typically developing people. These were people who had not seen the movie before. This is a very intense movie. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it highly. But what we wanted to do was, how do they make sense out of these short clips of these very intense scenes? This was literally our first two people. The man is a man with autism who I've known for a long, long time. He was the first person I knew with autism who went to college. I just heard from him today about something, actually. He's still very much alive and involved in autism work. But he is significantly impaired, even though he's very high functioning. He lives by himself, holds down a job, but does not have many friends and is rather isolated. We also had a typical viewer who was actually not quite as bright as the man with autism. And we showed them about 5 seconds of the movie, which is now condensed onto this frame. And what you can see here, the typical viewer in this fairly intense scene between Elizabeth Taylor and her husband, both in the movie and in real life, Richard Burton, is that the typical viewer goes back and forth between the top half of the face. The viewer with autism goes back and forth to the mouth. This was surprising to us. We thought people with autism would just be looking at everything in the background. That's actually not true. It's a very interesting finding, and it's held up really, really, really well in subsequent research. It's a different way of looking at the world, and you lose a lot by that focus on the mouth. You get the words, but you don't get the affective response. So we know as a result of all these things that there are really very different approaches to learning about the world in autism. How do we help the person with autism learn more effectively? Well, over time, we've had better treatments and we have seen a marked shift in outcome. And I want to say a word about that. In the 50s up through 1980, the model was blaming the parents, the psychodynamic model. Well, it's something about what the parents have done something to the child. Only a minority of children were sent to school. This changed dramatically for several reasons. Most importantly, in the United States, as a result of federal law, Public Law 94-142 back in 1975, which was a whole part of a whole package of laws around civil issues of civil rights, including rights for disabilities. And it made the mandate for school something that was really written into the federal system. Any school that took a cent of federal money had to give a free and appropriate education to any child who walked through the door. This was a beginning of a major shift in treatment. So all of a sudden we went from being told, parents being told, oh, put your child away in some state institution or keep them at home, we can't treat them. All of a sudden, the schools had to provide educational services. And this led to a major shift in outcome. So in the 1980s, we had official recognition. The work on intervention began to increase as autism had been officially recognized, and we started to have evidence-based interventions. There was a very influential report from the National Research Council, which is provided in your references, that looked at 10 model programs around the country that had at least one study that showed in a peer-reviewed journal that their system worked for kids with autism. This is now rather dated, but at the time, this was really groundbreaking, because we saw that for all these 10 programs, there were many similarities, and there was a few differences, but they led for many, but not all children, to major improvements of outcome. So how is improved outcome reflected? Well, more people can communicate verbally. That's changed dramatically over time. We have more and more people with autism, autism spectrum disorder, functioning in the normal range of intelligence. This also means they have somewhat more potential for being involved in the legal system in some way. And as you will hear about in other talks, there's a marked increased risk for legal involvement of all kinds. We have more and more and more of them going on to colleges and jobs, although I should point out that there are some issues. And the issues have to do with, once we get kids out of college with ASD, the problem is only about half find work, and the half that do find work are underemployed. This is in marked contrast to every other disability. People with other disabilities, wheelchairs, blind, deaf, when they get through college, they earn like anybody else that gets through college. Not so folks with autism. They learn when they have a job, they earn at about the level of a high school graduate. And this is to show you some of the outcome data on autism. I emphasize I'm cherry picking the studies I'm looking at. These are all published studies. These are data that are abstracted from Patricia Howland's chapter in the Handbook of Autism, which is one of the standard works. And I picked here the first studies that she reports on in autism. And I start in 56, which was Connor and Eisenberg, as I recall. And I stopped in 1974 because a year later, we have Public Law 142 kicking in. And then I start up again, as you can see, about 15 years later. And I stopped just before DSM-4 came out, which might have also impacted the outcome data by including things like Asperger's. But look at what's happened. Good, fair, and poor outcome. Good means you're independent as an adult. You're functioning out in the world on your own. Fair means semi-independent. You're out there, but you have some reliance on your parents or siblings or somebody else. And poor means you're in 24/7 residential care. And again, look at what's happened to this shift. And these data are now quite dated. And of course, the reason they're dated is it takes a long time to do these kinds of follow-up studies. But look at the shift from good here to good here, probably from averaging around 5% here to maybe averaging 25%, with a noteworthy decrease from about 2/3 of kids being as adults in institutional settings to a much lower number. And there's good reason to think that this has continued over time. So let me say a word about effective management strategies. This may be relevant to people in the legal system who have to deal with people with autism. Just talking a little bit about what we know and what we think from what we know about how you can be more effective in working with a person with autism. I should emphasize, all these strategies vary somewhat with age and cognitive ability. So keep in mind, there's a broad range in age and cognitive ability. We go from very young infants to the elderly. We go from people who have very severe intellectual deficiency or what used to be called mental retardation to people who are really quite bright indeed. So you have to keep that in mind and be prepared to adapt. But with that said, if you have trouble understanding social cues, what could you do to be helpful? Well, a couple things. You can exaggerate. You can make your voice louder. You can use more gestures. You can pair gestures with words. You can also teach more in context. You can avoid overly elaborate language, keeping things more straightforward and be very explicit. Did you see X? Not just general talking about things, but being very explicit about what you want. If they have problems in organization, which is very typical, be stepwise, be consistent in how you approach, give visual aids. Here's number 1, here's number 2, I'm going to ask you about, here's number 3, here's number 4, and give plenty of time. The time is not because people are quote unquote dumb, it's because they have slow processing and they get to it, but they have to take a little extra time to get to it. So always give people with ASD a little extra time to answer. Also keep in mind that attentional problems can be a major issue. If you've got a very busy environment, you can see my study in the background, this would not be a good place to talk to somebody with autism. There are all kinds of things that pull for their attention. There's a fish tank, there's a bird, there's stuff on the wall, there's all kinds of stuff. This would not be good. It would be better to have a much cleaner room and to be able to talk to them directly in a low-key and straightforward way. Structuring the environment is also important. So keeping them in a situation where they're not going to be impacted by extraneous sounds, noises, all of that you can isolate as much as possible. Also, people with autism can have trouble sequencing. They can get derailed. So again, use visual cues. We're going to talk about this, then we're going to talk about this, then we're going to talk about that. Be consistent and predictable. People with autism don't deal well with change, and they don't like unpredictability. So other strategies, people with autism tend to learn things in chunks. And this means that when we talk to them, you have to realize the person with autism may know things in one context, but they don't generalize. I have a man I've worked with for years now with Asperger's who's got an IQ of 140. He's a genius. He's a math genius. He has a special kind of equations. He cannot walk into McDonald's and get a cheeseburger and change. And that should be straightforward. A cheeseburger is 99 cents. He gives $1. He gets a cheeseburger and a penny back. He can't do it. The reason he can't do it is because of his learning style. He has a vision of how this is going to happen. He walks into McDonald's and there's a perky lady behind the counter who says to him, "Would you like to try our chicken fajita special?" And he's thrown off. He hasn't expected that. And he doesn't know what to do, but he does know he would like to have a girlfriend. And maybe if he bought her chicken fajita, which he doesn't really want, she would be his girlfriend. So he retreats. And that's the kind of thing that you can see. That's one of the reasons why the generalization of Gestalt learning really is important. And it's one of the things we really talk about in terms of outcome. It's ability to have street smarts, to know that math works across settings, that you can use your skills across settings. And again, to keep in mind that that's going to be a problem for many people with ASD. Using, again, the visual learning style, having things written down, giving visual cues, keeping your language simple. One of the problems often when you see somebody losing it is you get more polite. The trouble with getting more polite is your language gets more complicated. All of a sudden, you're using the subjunctive, for goodness sake. And that's not a good way to go. Keep it simple. Help the person calm down. Don't set them off. So short, simple language can be helpful. Trouble with time and temporal systems and temporal sequences, again, giving very explicit, concrete instruction, using visuals, adequate time with clear expectations of what you want, and giving feedback. Well, that was really helpful, or I still don't understand. Can you say it a different way? Those are the kinds of things that could be useful. For the more cognitively able, a funny other set of complexities arise. Sometimes we hear people at school say, well, he's too bright or he's too verbal to have autism. That's not true at all. You can be quite socially disabled and be quite bright. Like I just gave you the example of a man in McDonald's, somebody who's very bright, but very non-functional because he can't sort of cope with the world. Also, sometimes people will sort of equate vocabulary size with being functional. That's a big mistake, especially for folks with Asperger's who know a lot of words, but they're really quite socially disabled. The variability of presentation across settings is quite dramatic. The person in the courtroom may look very different from the person out in public or in school settings or out in the world pumping gas. It's a whole package. One of the other problems for schools in particular is schools have terms for basically for bad acting children, mostly boys. So they have terms for bad boys, SEM, SED, ED, BD. These refer to social emotionally maladjusted, social emotionally disturbed, behavior disturbed. These are basically bad boys, and they have bad boy classes. So they think, oh, this kid is a bad boy because he's asking too many questions, or he's being disruptive in the classroom by having his hand up all the time. And all of a sudden they say, okay, let's put him in the class for bad boys. It's like putting a lamb among the wolves. And literally within 5 minutes, trouble will typically start. Also, I think to remind parents and other supporters, advocacy is really important, and knowing entitlements, to what people are entitled to, what supports can be of help to them. This varies from state to state and also with age. And even with the most able people, and there's been a description of people who have optimal outcome, who quote unquote outgrow their autism, who no longer technically meet the criteria, they're still socially vulnerable. So from the point of view of understanding and advocacy, a few pointers: know what's the level of a person's communicative ability and how is their social ability? What do they understand? How do they interact with other people? Do they have friends, or is their relationship confined solely to family or people that deal with them? Are they verbal, and how verbal, and what do they understand? Be very explicit, and also be aware that the social nuance may be lost. Also know that people with autism may be quite literal. They often rely on rules to negotiate the world. The light says, don't walk. They'll stop in the middle of the street light. So that's the kind of thing to know. Also things like irony, sarcasm may be totally lost on them. They may misinterpret. They hear somebody say it's raining cats and dogs. They're looking out the window, looking for the cats and dogs. And again, the people with autism are sometimes overly rule governed. Paradoxically, this can cause some legal trouble. They may not, for example, adjust their driving speed depending on the road conditions, or they may not make adjustments if they see signs ahead that say, okay, you're gonna have to have a detour. They may get stuck with that. There's often an intense desire for connections and friendships, especially in adulthood. This can lead to its own set of problems, issues around stalking, for example, where somebody is trying to make a friend, but they don't know how to carry it off, and they don't know how to hear the word no. And other things like attempts to cope with anxiety. For example, after 9/11, I know of a number of kids with Asperger's. One of the ways they wanted to cope with the intense anxiety they felt about this bombing was to get information that helps them feel more comfortable. So the next thing you know, they're on the internet as much as they can, 24/7, reading about bombs and ISIS and Al Qaeda and everything else. And of course, what that does then elicit is a knock on the door from federal authorities wondering, why are they online looking at these websites? And again, that's a very interesting and complicated issue that we'll hear about, I'm sure, in some of the lectures. So in dealing with a person with autism, accept in emergencies, take your time. Emergencies are a different story. Give the person time to process. Use family members, people who know the person well, whenever you can. That will be helpful. Be clear and explicit. Don't be implicit and don't be overly polite. Keep your language simple and direct, and use resources to help the person function as needed for things like jobs, transition services, parent support networks. All of these are out there and can be used quite effectively. So in summary, people with autism spectrum disorders have very unique challenges in social interaction that start very early in life. They have problems in communication, even when they're verbal. They may be very literal in their understanding of language, and they're overly responsive to the non-social world. So they may get upset by change. Things like flashing lights on police cars might set them off. Overly loud, noisy environments may set them off. So all these things are things to be aware of in dealing with a person with ASD. So in summary here, again, people with autism are at markedly increased risk for legal problems. This is partly due to miscommunication problems. It's also because of problems with anxiety, which further exacerbates disorganization, especially in new situations. Often the close desire for friends causes difficulties as they get into problems because they don't respond well to feedback. The tendency, paradoxically, to overly respond to rules and be rule governed can cause its own set of issues. They may have trouble processing information and easily get distracted, so they may miss important things. They can be quite sensitive to things in the environment, which can throw them off very readily. And again, to deal with anxiety by looking for more information is a common problem and a common source of difficulty for the person with ASD who may, for example, if they're glued to the television and one specific channel, they may get a lot of misinformation which they think is true, and they're just taking it all in. Also, as Leo Kalner mentioned himself, these are people who don't necessarily wear their disability on their face. It's not the same thing, for example, as with Down syndrome, where you immediately look at the person and you realize, looking at their facial asymmetries, oh, this is a person with special needs. People with autism, as a general rule, don't have that. And especially as children, they're often quite attractive. And you think, well, there's nothing wrong with this child. Just by looking at them, it's only interacting with them that you realize the nature and severity of their social difficulty. I want to thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found this somewhat helpful as an introduction to autism and the autism spectrum. Thank you and good day.